If George Patton had arrived just 1 hour later, the 101st Airborne Division would not have been taken prisoner. They would have been erased. Completely annihilated. Wiped from existence in the frozen forests of Belgium. This is not speculation. This is documented fact, written in the desperate communications between commanders who watched the clock tick toward catastrophe. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Winter had turned the Belgian countryside into a frozen hell. Snow fell in thick curtains, blanketing roads, forests, and the small crossroads town that would become the most important piece of ground in Western Europe. Bastogne. Most Americans had never heard of it. Within days, it would become a name seared into history. 10,000 American soldiers, most of them elite paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division, found themselves completely surrounded. German panzer divisions pressed in from every direction, their commanders operating under direct orders from Adolf Hitler himself. Not orders to capture. Orders to destroy. To make an example. To prove that Germany could still strike terror into Allied hearts. Inside the shrinking perimeter, conditions deteriorated by the hour. Ammunition supplies dwindled to handfuls of rounds per rifle. Artillery batteries counted their shells like misers counting gold, each shot a precious commodity they couldn't afford to waste. Medical supplies ran out entirely. Wounded men lay in freezing basements and barns, sometimes 3 to a stretcher, often on bare earth. No bandages. No morphine. No heat. The cold itself became an enemy as deadly as German steel. Above it all, the weather mocked every hope of rescue. Thick clouds grounded the entire Allied air fleet. No fighter bombers to strike German positions. No transport planes to drop supplies. No reconnaissance flights to assess the situation. The men at Bastogne were alone, and they knew it. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the reality settled over the command staff like a funeral shroud. Every rational military assessment pointed to the same conclusion. The 101st Airborne Division was doomed. The numbers were simple and brutal. They had perhaps 4 days of ammunition remaining, maybe 5 if they were lucky and careful. After that, they would be defenseless. German forces outnumbered them several times over and showed no sign of relenting. Every hour brought fresh attacks, each one probing for weakness, testing the American lines. Everyone accepted this grim reality. Staff officers, intelligence analysts, logistics coordinators, all of them began making contingency plans for the loss of an entire division. Everyone accepted it. Everyone except 2 men. The first was Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Western Europe. The man who carried the weight of millions of lives across his shoulders. The general who had ordered the invasion of Normandy and watched young men wade into fire. Who had made 1,000 impossible decisions and would make 1,000 more before this war ended. He stood in the Situation Room at SHEF headquarters on the 19th of December, 1944, staring at the maps that covered every wall and table. The neat colored lines and precise unit markers that had represented orderly Allied progress toward Germany had transformed overnight into a nightmare. German forces had smashed into the Ardennes days earlier, punching a massive bulge into the American front. Entire units had been overrun or simply disappeared in the chaos. Roads were cut. Communications severed. The careful plans of months thrown into sudden, violent disarray. But it was Bastogne that dominated every conversation, every anxious glance at the maps. The town sat at the center of a critical road network. 7 major highways converged there, highways the Germans desperately needed if they hoped to drive their offensive all the way to the Meuse River and beyond. If Bastogne fell, those roads would open. The German advance could accelerate. The Allied front could split entirely. More than that, the troops trapped there represented something beyond mere tactical value. These were the Screaming Eagles, the legendary 101st Airborne. These were men who had jumped into darkness over Normandy on D-Day, who had fought through the nightmare of the hedgerows, who had paid in blood for every mile from the beaches to the German border. They had become symbols of American courage, living proof that American forces could match the Wehrmacht blow for blow. Their destruction would be more than a military defeat. It would be a psychological catastrophe that would echo through every barracks, every command post, every home in America. An intelligence officer approached Eisenhower's position at the main map table. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed from too many sleepless nights. "Sir," he began, his voice carefully neutral in the way of men delivering unbearable news, "the latest assessment on Bastogne." Eisenhower turned to face him, and everyone in the room could see the toll these past days had taken. His face was lined with exhaustion. He had been awake more than asleep since the German offensive began, surviving on coffee and cigarettes and the desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, a solution would present itself. "How long can they hold?" Eisenhower asked. It was the only question that mattered. Everything else was noise. The intelligence officer hesitated. He understood that his answer was not merely information. It was a sentence being pronounced on 10,000 men. "Sir," he said finally, choosing each word carefully, realistically, 4 days. Perhaps 5 if everything breaks their way. After that, they will be completely out of ammunition and supplies. The Germans will overwhelm them. The room fell into heavy silence. 4 days. Maybe 5. And then 10,000 American soldiers would die or be captured while the Allied High Command watched helplessly from hundreds of miles away. Eisenhower's jaw tightened. His hands, resting on the edge of the map table, clenched into fists. "What options do we have to relieve them?" he demanded, though the desperation in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. The responses came quickly, each one closing another door. British forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery were heavily engaged containing the northern shoulder of the German advance. They were positioned wrong and lacked the mobility to drive south quickly. Other American armies were fighting desperate defensive battles just to maintain their own positions. Nobody had the troops, the fuel, the positioning, and most critically, the time to launch a counteroffensive toward Bastogne that could arrive before the ammunition ran out. Nobody except one army. Third Army, currently operating far to the south in the Saar region under the command of Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr. The name alone changed the atmosphere in the room. Everyone present knew Patton. His reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Brilliant. Aggressive. Utterly convinced of his own genius. Also volatile, politically tone-deaf, prone to statements that caused diplomatic incidents and public relations nightmares. Eisenhower had spent years managing Patton's extraordinary talent and equally extraordinary ego. He had defended Patton after the slapping incidents in Sicily, when the general had physically struck hospitalized soldiers he accused of cowardice, nearly ending Patton's career in disgrace. He had used Patton as a decoy before D-Day, letting German intelligence believe the main invasion would come at Calais because Patton, obviously the Allies' best general, was positioned there. He had unleashed Patton across France in the summer of 1944, watching Third Army race across the countryside in one of the most spectacular advances in military history. He had also reprimanded Patton, restricted him, censored him, and seriously considered relieving him of command on multiple occasions. Managing George Patton was like trying to harness a thunderstorm. It was exhausting, frequently frustrating, occasionally infuriating, and absolutely necessary because when you needed lightning to strike, Patton delivered. Now, staring at the shrinking circle around Bastogne on the map, Eisenhower made his decision. He did not need a careful, politically astute general. He did not need someone who would cautiously evaluate every option and choose the safest course. He needed someone who would attempt the impossible and somehow make it work through sheer force of will. "Get me Patton," Eisenhower ordered. "Tell him I want him at Verdun tomorrow for an emergency commanders' conference. And tell him to bring plans for offensive operations northward. He'll know what that means." After his staff dispersed to execute his orders, Eisenhower remained alone in the Situation Room. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded in his diary that evening that he found the Supreme Commander standing motionless before the map, lips moving silently. When Butcher asked if everything was all right, Eisenhower seemed startled, as if he had forgotten anyone else existed. "I was praying, Harry," Eisenhower admitted quietly. "Or maybe just talking to myself. Hard to tell the difference anymore." He turned back to the map, to that circle around Bastogne. "George," he said softly, as if Patton could somehow hear him across the miles, "for once in this damned war, do exactly what I need you to do. Those paratroopers are counting on you. America is counting on you. I am counting on you. Do not let me down." The following day, December 19, 1944, the meeting at Verdun would enter military legend. Historians would write about it for generations, studying the moment when Patton made a promise that seemed to defy the laws of physics and military logistics. But often overlooked in those retellings is what Eisenhower said: how much was truly at stake, and just how close the entire enterprise came to complete disaster. The headquarters at Verdun was cold despite the efforts of inadequate heating systems. Officers moved through corridors with their breath visible in small clouds. The main conference room was crowded with the men who commanded the Western Front, generals whose decisions directed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, who had carried the Allied armies from the beaches of Normandy to the very borders of Germany. Eisenhower opened the meeting with a calculated statement about opportunity rather than disaster. He told them the German offensive, while serious, had also exposed German flanks to counterattack. It was a brave face placed on a desperate situation, and everyone in that room understood the subtext. They were facing the most serious crisis since D-Day itself. Then Eisenhower laid out the core problem with brutal clarity. The German offensive had driven a bulge into the Allied lines, disrupting communications and logistics. At the center of that bulge sat Bastogne, surrounded, outnumbered, running out of time. If Bastogne fell, the Germans could exploit the road network and drive deeper into Allied territory, potentially splitting the entire front. If Bastogne held, that same road network could become a trap, allowing Allied forces to cut off and destroy the German spearheads. Everything depended on relief reaching Bastogne before its ammunition ran out. Everything depended on speed. Eisenhower looked around the table, making eye contact with each commander. "I want each of you to consider this question carefully before answering. How soon can you launch an offensive to relieve Bastogne?" The generals began their mental calculations. Divisions available and their current positions. Road networks and their capacity. Fuel stocks and ammunition reserves. How long it would take to disengage units from their current missions, reorient them, move them into position, and launch a coordinated attack. These were complex problems without easy answers. Days. Perhaps weeks. No one wanted to promise more than they could deliver. Then George Patton spoke, his voice cutting through the careful deliberations like a knife. "I can attack on the 22nd, he announced, with 3 divisions. The room went absolutely still. Eyes turned toward Patton. Some officers assumed he was bluffing, making an impossible boast to grab attention and glory. They had seen Patton's showmanship before. To disengage multiple divisions from active combat operations, execute a 90-degree pivot with an entire army, move roughly 100 miles through winter weather on roads clogged with refugees and retreating troops, organize logistics for that movement, and launch a coordinated offensive against the flank of a German attack, all in 3 days, was simply impossible. It violated every principle of military planning and logistics. It could not be done. Eisenhower did not smile. He did not congratulate Patton on his confidence. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the Third Army commander and spoke slowly, letting every word carry its full weight. "George," Eisenhower said, his voice deadly serious, "I am not asking for optimism. I am not asking what might be theoretically possible if everything goes perfectly. I am asking what you can actually accomplish. Truly accomplish. The lives of 10,000 American soldiers depend on your answer. The men of the 101st Airborne Division are surrounded, outnumbered, running out of ammunition and supplies. If you say you will be there and you are not, they die. All of them. Not captured. Not wounded. Dead. I will ask you again, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Can you attack on the 22nd of December? The room held its collective breath. This was not a normal exchange between commanding officers. This was Eisenhower putting Patton on the record, making him fully responsible for the promise he was about to make. Patton did not hesitate. He leaned forward, his voice confident and clear. Ike, I already have 3 complete plans prepared. My staff has anticipated this possibility. We have wargamed 3 separate contingencies for turning 3rd Army north. The moment I received your summons yesterday, I put the preliminary orders in motion. On the 22nd of December, my 4th Armored Division will be attacking northward toward Bastogne. That is not a guess. It is not a hope. It is not optimism. It is a fact. Eisenhower studied Patton's face for a long moment, searching for any sign of bluff or bravado or the usual Patton theatrical performance. Instead, he saw something rarer in his difficult subordinate. Complete, hard-edged certainty. Very well, George, Eisenhower said at last. You have your mission. Relieve Bastogne. You have full operational freedom to execute as you see fit. Use whatever resources you need. Then his tone changed. Everyone in the room felt it, a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the inadequate heating. But understand this clearly. If you fail, if those paratroopers die because you did not deliver what you promised here today, I will personally see that you never command troops again. Not just relieved from 3rd Army. Finished. Done. Your career will end in disgrace. Am I absolutely clear? Crystal clear, sir, Patton answered without flinching. I will not fail. Later that day, after the conference ended and the various commanders dispersed to their headquarters, Eisenhower pulled his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, aside. Smith's notes from that conversation survive in the archives. The boss asked me if I thought George could really do it, Smith wrote. I told him honestly that it sounded impossible. The logistics alone seemed insurmountable. Ike was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the gray sky. Then he said something I'll never forget, that is precisely why I am sending Patton. Impossible is what he does. What followed over the next 7 days was, on paper, a series of military movements and engagements. Division orders, supply manifests, after-action reports, the dry documentary record of armies in motion. But the reality behind those documents was a race against a merciless countdown clock, with 10,000 lives hanging in the balance and 2 commanders, separated by hundreds of miles, bound together by a promise and a prayer. While Patton's staff frantically issued orders, rerouted traffic, reorganized supply lines, and executed one of the most complex military maneuvers of the entire war, Eisenhower watched from Supreme Headquarters, living hour to hour on scraps of news that filtered back from the front. And the news from Bastogne grew worse with each passing hour. German artillery pounded American positions day and night, methodical and remorseless. Shells screamed into the town, exploding among the buildings where American troops had established aid stations and command posts. German infantry pressed closer, supported by tanks, testing the perimeter for weak points, probing with each attack. Inside the shrinking circle, ammunition dwindled with each defensive fire mission. Medical officers begged in increasingly desperate radio messages for supplies they knew could not come. Bandages. Morphine. Plasma. Blankets. The wounded shivered in basements and barns, their suffering made worse by the knowledge that help might not arrive in time. On the 22nd of December, exactly as promised, elements of 3rd Army began their attack northward. They immediately ran into everything that winter and the Wehrmacht could throw at them. Roads covered in ice that sent vehicles sliding off into ditches. Bridges demolished by retreating German engineers, requiring engineers to construct temporary spans while under fire. German rear guards fighting with desperate intensity to slow the American advance. Anti-tank guns positioned in villages along the route, taking out lead vehicles and blocking entire columns. Ambushes in the forests flanking the roads. Minefields that claimed men and machines. The advance was slower than anyone had hoped. Much slower. At Bastogne, the situation tightened further. Some units were rationing ammunition so strictly they were down to a few rounds per rifle. Artillery batteries had so little ammunition that fire missions were approved only for the most critical targets. Some wounded men lay 2 or 3 to a stretcher when stretchers could be found, or simply on the frozen ground when they could not. Frostbite claimed nearly as many men as German fire. Sentries stared out into the blowing snow, knowing that somewhere beyond that white curtain, more German troops were forming for yet another assault. Eisenhower sent a message to General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, hold at all costs. Relief is on the way. But in his private notes, locked away in his personal safe, he admitted what he could not say publicly. He had gambled everything on Patton. If Third Army did not break through, if the relief failed, Bastogne would fall and the responsibility would rest entirely on the man who had authorized the attempt. On December 23, fortune granted one small mercy. The weather over Bastogne cleared enough for Allied transport aircraft to attempt resupply. C-47 transport planes roared over the town at low altitude while German anti-aircraft guns threw up curtains of fire. Paratroopers watched parachutes bloom above them like slow-motion salvation, supplies swaying beneath them as they drifted down. Some landed inside American lines. Some landed in no man's land, requiring desperate retrieval missions under fire. Some landed in German positions and were lost. But enough got through to buy time. Not much time. But some. It was also on December 23 that German commanders, increasingly frustrated by the stubborn American resistance, sent a formal surrender demand into Bastogne under flag of truce. The message was clear: surrender now and be treated as prisoners of war, or continue fighting and be annihilated when German forces finally overran the position. General McAuliffe read the demand, grabbed a pencil, and scrawled a single word on a piece of paper: nuts. When his staff asked if he wanted to elaborate, McAuliffe shook his head. That says it all. The German envoys departed, thoroughly confused about what nuts meant but understanding perfectly well that it was not an acceptance of their terms. When Eisenhower received the report of McAuliffe's response, a brief smile flickered across his exhausted face. At least their spirit is not broken, he told his staff. But he knew spirit alone could not stop shells or bullets. Patton had to get there. December 24. Christmas Eve. In homes across America, families gathered around Christmas trees, sang carols, opened presents, and prayed for loved ones overseas. In Bastogne, men huddled in frozen foxholes and ruined buildings, counting their remaining ammunition and wondering if they would live to see Christmas morning. At Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower tried to maintain the appearance of calm leadership while anxiety gnawed at him from within. That evening, an aide found Eisenhower alone at his desk, surrounded by papers. Not battle reports or logistical assessments. Letters. Dozens of them, some half-finished, some complete but unsigned. Condolence letters to families. To mothers and fathers, wives and children, brothers and sisters. Letters explaining that their loved one, serving with the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, had died in service to his country. Letters Eisenhower prayed he would never have to send but felt compelled to prepare because if relief did not arrive, someone would have to write these letters, and he believed it should be him. "Sir," the aide said gently, "you should rest. Even for just a few hours." Eisenhower looked up, his eyes red-rimmed with fatigue. "I hope to God I do not have to sign these," he said quietly, gesturing at the letters. "But if I do, they deserve better than a form letter. They deserve to know their sacrifice mattered." He returned to his writing, and the aide withdrew silently. Christmas Day, December 25, 1944. The day should have been filled with peace and celebration. For Eisenhower, it was 24 hours of gnawing anxiety. He attended chapel services that morning, trying to find a few moments of spiritual calm, but he kept glancing toward the door, waiting for updates. Reports from Third Army indicated they were still fighting forward, getting closer, but Bastogne remained surrounded. The margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. December 26, 1944. The day dawned cold and gray. At Bastogne, the defenders had been surrounded for 7 days, had been fighting constantly for longer than that. They were exhausted, battered, pushed to the very edge of human endurance. German forces prepared for what they intended to be the final assault. At Third Army, Patton's 4th Armored Division was fighting through the last German defensive positions between them and Bastogne, suffering casualties with every yard gained but refusing to stop. At Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower moved through his morning routine like an automaton, signing papers without reading them, attending briefings without hearing them, his mind entirely focused on that one circled position on the map. His staff tried to keep him occupied, tried to distract him with other matters requiring his attention, but everyone knew it was useless. The Supreme Commander was waiting for a phone call that would determine whether he had saved 10,000 men or sent them to their deaths. At 10 minutes before 5 in the afternoon, the telephone on Eisenhower's desk rang. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet office. His aide, sitting nearby, grabbed the receiver. Supreme Commander's office. He listened for a moment, and his face transformed. "Yes, sir." "One moment, sir." He turned to Eisenhower, and there was something in his expression that made everyone in the room freeze. "Sir," he said, his voice barely controlled, "it is General Patton. He says it is urgent." Eisenhower snatched the receiver from his aide's hand. "Patton." The voice that came through the line crackled with distance and static, but the words were clear. "Ike, we're through. 4th Armored made contact with the 101st Airborne at 1650 hours. The corridor is narrow, and we're taking fire from both sides, but it is open. We are pushing supplies and reinforcements through right now. Bastogne is relieved." For a heartbeat, maybe two, Eisenhower said nothing. Could not speak. The men watching him saw his shoulders sag as if a massive weight had physically lifted from them. His hand tightened around the telephone receiver until his knuckles turned white. His eyes closed. When he opened them, they were wet. "George," he finally managed, his voice thick and unsteady, "say that again." "We're through to Bastogne," Patton repeated, and there was audible relief even in his confident voice. "The Screaming Eagles are safe. They are beaten up, undersupplied, and they've been through hell, but they held. We got there in time." Eisenhower had to pause, had to swallow hard before he could continue. "George, I thank God. Thank you. You did it. You actually did it. You saved them." Patton, characteristically uncomfortable with overt emotion, deflected. "Just doing my job, Ike. Those paratroopers did the real work. We just opened the door." Eisenhower would not let him minimize it. "No, George. Do not undersell this. You turned an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter, fought through a blizzard and German opposition, and broke through in 4 days when everyone said it was impossible. That is not just doing your job. That is why you are indispensable. Difficult as hell to manage, frequently infuriating, but absolutely indispensable." After the call ended, Eisenhower remained standing behind his desk, still holding the receiver, staring at the map on the wall where a new line now connected Third Army to Bastogne. The witnesses to that moment later recorded that tears ran openly down his face, and he made no effort to hide them. "Gentlemen," he said to his assembled staff, his voice still unsteady but filled with something that sounded like awe, "General Patton has just accomplished something I will remember as long as I live. He saved 10,000 American soldiers who were hours, perhaps minutes, from annihilation. He did what I asked him to do, when I asked him to do it, against odds that everyone said were impossible. George S. Patton is the most difficult subordinate I have ever had. He is also, beyond any question, beyond any doubt, one of the finest battlefield commanders this country has ever produced." Messages flew out immediately. Official congratulations to the 101st Airborne Division for their extraordinary, almost superhuman defense. Commendations to 3rd Army for their rapid and decisive relief operation. Reports to the War Department that Bastogne had been held and the German offensive blunted. But Eisenhower also sat down personally and wrote something more private, more personal. The telegram to Patton read, "George, words cannot adequately express my gratitude and admiration for what 3rd Army has accomplished. You gave your word that you would be there. You kept that word. In doing so, you saved not only 10,000 soldiers but potentially the entire Ardennes campaign. Bastogne will be studied for generations as an example of operational brilliance. Well done does not begin to cover it. I am proud to have you under my command. Ike." Later that evening, after the immediate crisis had passed and the initial reports had been filed, an aide found Eisenhower alone again in the Situation Room, looking at the same map, at the thin but now secure line connecting 3rd Army to Bastogne. "1 hour," Eisenhower said quietly, almost to himself. That's all he had. Just 1 hour. If 4th Armored had arrived 1 hour later, the ammunition would have run out completely. The Germans would have launched their final assault against defenseless positions. They would have overrun Bastogne before Patton could establish the corridor. He turned to face his aide, and his expression was haunted. 1 hour between salvation and annihilation. That's how close we came. In the days and weeks that followed, as the Battle of the Bulge continued and eventually turned in favor of the Allies, Eisenhower's private comments about Patton mixed profound relief with sober, almost clinical appreciation. To Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall in Washington, he wrote with complete candor, "George, Patton has just saved my command. Had Bastogne fallen with an entire airborne division destroyed or captured, the psychological and political impact would have been catastrophic. Questions would have been raised about our strategy, our competence, my leadership. Patton prevented that disaster. Whatever difficulties I have had with him, and they remain many, this operation alone justifies every painful decision I have made to keep him in command despite the controversies." To Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, coordinating operations on the northern shoulder of the German offensive, Eisenhower sent a pointed message: "Patton's relief of Bastogne is a clear demonstration of American operational capability and aggressive spirit. I trust this answers any lingering questions about American effectiveness." The words were diplomatic, but the subtext was unmistakable. American forces had not merely held under pressure, they had executed one of the most demanding maneuvers of the entire war and succeeded brilliantly. In his private diary, Eisenhower was even more revealing. He admitted that there had been many times, too many to count, when he had wanted to relieve Patton and be done with the headaches. Times when he had seriously questioned whether Patton's brilliance was worth the constant supervision, the political fires, the diplomatic incidents. Bastogne answered that question definitively, he wrote. "Patton is worth every frustration, every angry conversation, every moment of anxiety about what he might say or do next. When it mattered most, when 10,000 men stood on the brink of annihilation, when the entire campaign hung in the balance, George delivered. Not eventually. Not approximately. Exactly when and how he said he would. That is the mark of a truly great commander." Years later, long after the war ended, after both men had retired from active service, Eisenhower continued to reflect on those December days. In his memoir, Crusade in Europe, published in 1948, he devoted careful attention to the Bastogne episode. He described the relief of the town by 3rd Army as one of the pivotal moments of the Western European campaign, a demonstration of American operational flexibility and fighting spirit that had profound effects beyond the immediate tactical situation. He stressed particularly the extraordinary speed with which 3rd Army had disengaged from active operations, executed a 90-degree pivot, and driven north through winter conditions to break through German lines. In military staff colleges, he noted, such movements were discussed as theoretical exercises, problems to be studied and debated. At Bastogne, theory became reality through a combination of brilliant planning, aggressive execution, and sheer determination. In a television interview conducted in 1963, not long before his death, Eisenhower was asked to name the most difficult command decision he had made during the entire war. The interviewer clearly expected him to cite the decision to launch the D-Day invasion, or perhaps the choice to pursue a broad front strategy across France rather than a single concentrated thrust into Germany. Instead, Eisenhower paused for a long moment, his aged face reflective. "Trusting George Patton to relieve Bastogne," he said finally. "That was a gamble of the highest order. I was wagering the lives of 10,000 paratroopers, the stability of our entire defensive position, potentially the success of our entire campaign in Western Europe, on a man who had often been difficult to control, who had caused me countless problems. But I also knew, absolutely knew, that he was the only one who could accomplish what needed to be done in the time we had available." He paused again, and his eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing again that map in the Situation Room, that shrinking circle around Bastogne. "When that phone call came through, when I heard George's voice saying, 'We're through to Bastogne, the Screaming Eagles are safe,' I felt a relief and gratitude that I still cannot fully describe, even all these years later. Those 4 words, 'We're through to Bastogne,' may have been the most important 4 words I heard during the entire war." In his final reflections on the war, written in private notes that were discovered after his death, Eisenhower attempted to capture the paradox of George Patton in a few carefully chosen sentences. He wrote that the Second World War had produced many fine generals, men who would be remembered and honored by history. Some would be remembered for careful planning and meticulous preparation. Some for political skill and diplomatic acumen. Some for steady, reliable competence that could be counted on in any situation. But only a very few, he wrote, will be remembered for saving an entire division from destruction through sheer operational daring and brilliant execution. That is Patton at Bastogne. Difficult, yes. Flawed, absolutely. Controversial, without question. But also the man who refused to accept that 10,000 Americans were doomed, who gave his word that he would reach them, and who kept that word against impossible odds. History will debate George Patton endlessly, as it should. But history cannot deny what he accomplished in those crucial days of December 1944. The relief of Bastogne was more than a tactical victory on a winter battlefield, more than a dramatic episode to be studied in military academies. It was the moment when a commander's faith in a difficult genius paid off spectacularly. When a wild talent, carefully managed and finally unleashed at the critical moment, proved that sometimes the most troublesome people are precisely the ones who pull off the miracles that others consider flatly impossible. It was the intersection of stubborn, almost superhuman courage in the foxholes of Bastogne with audacious decision-making in the command posts hundreds of miles away. It was 10,000 men refusing to surrender, 2 commanders bound by mutual respect and a shared mission, and an entire army executing a maneuver that redefined what was possible. All of it balanced on the edge of disaster, on a knife's edge of timing that came down to a single hour, perhaps less, between salvation and complete annihilation. And it was captured, ultimately, in 4 simple words crackling over a telephone line. 4 words that released days of unbearable tension and anxiety. 4 words that Dwight Eisenhower would remember for the rest of his life. "We're through to Bastogne." Those 4 words meant that 10,000 men would go home. Would see their families again. Would live to tell their grandchildren about the time they held a frozen Belgian crossroads town against impossible odds and refused to surrender. Would carry forward the legacy of American courage and determination. Those 4 words vindicated a difficult, controversial general and proved that genius comes in many forms, not all of them comfortable or convenient. Those 4 words validated a supreme commander's agonizing decision to gamble everything on a man he often struggled to control but ultimately knew he could count on when it mattered most. If this story of impossible odds, agonizing decisions, difficult genius rewarded, and the words that defined a moment in history spoke to you, then stay with us. We are here to bring you the hidden moments, the private conversations, the human drama behind history's greatest battles. The decisions made in quiet rooms that determined the fates of thousands. The words spoken that changed everything. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Leave a comment telling us what leadership under pressure means to you. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that refusing to accept defeat, that betting on yourself and the people you believe in, that doing the impossible because it is necessary, can change everything. Not just in war. In life. Remember that sometimes the most difficult people are the ones who accomplish what everyone else said could not be done. Remember that real leadership means making the hardest choices and living with the consequences. Remember Bastogne, where courage met determination, where genius met opportunity, and where 4 words delivered over a crackling telephone line meant the difference between annihilation and salvation.